The SR-71 Blackbird never ran from fighters. It didn't need to. At over 85,000 feet, flying faster than any missile could realistically chase, the Blackbird existed in a category of its own. It didn't maneuver defensively. It didn't react. When threats appeared on radar, the response was almost insulting in its simplicity. Maintain speed, maintain altitude, continue the mission. By the time anyone below finished reacting, the SR-71 was already gone. That confidence was earned. For years, interceptors tried and failed. Fighters climbed hard, ran out of energy and fell back. Missiles launched, burned out, and disappeared behind it. The Blackbird's legend wasn't built on secrecy or stealth. It was built on physics, faster than pursuit, higher than interception, too far ahead of the problem to care. And that's why what Britain did next mattered. Because the Royal Air Force never tried to chase the SR-71. They knew that was pointless. Instead, they asked a quieter, more dangerous question. What if you didn't follow it at all? During the Cold War, SR-71 flights followed carefully planned routes. Not because they were careless, but because at Mach 3, efficiency was survival. Fuel flow, thermal limits, and navigation demanded stability. Deviating too much wasn't tactical freedom, it was risk. The Blackbird flew predictable tracks because predictability kept it alive. The RAF noticed that. And while others obsessed over speed comparisons, British planners looked at timing. If you knew where the Blackbird would be, and you knew exactly when it would be there, then maybe you didn't need to be faster. You just needed to arrive first. That idea led them to an aircraft already considered extreme, even by Cold War standards. The English Electric Lightning wasn't graceful, it wasn't efficient, it carried limited fuel and punished mistakes instantly. Pilots respected it the way you respect something that can hurt you if you get careless. But it had one trait that mattered more than anything else: climb. When launched light and flown aggressively, the Lightning could convert fuel into altitude at a rate few aircraft could survive structurally, let alone operationally. It didn't accelerate forward like most fighters, it went up, violently, relentlessly, borrowing altitude with no intention of staying. The plan was brutal in its precision. Fuel loads were stripped to the minimum. Weapons were irrelevant. This was not a combat intercept. This was a geometry problem. The Lightning would take off early, climb hard, and aim not for the Blackbird itself, but for a point in space the Blackbird hadn't reached yet. A vertical ambush. The window was measured in seconds. Too early and the Lightning would waste energy and fall short. Too late and the Blackbird would pass overhead, unreachable as ever. Too aggressive and the Lightning would bleed speed before arrival. Too cautious and it would never get there in time. There would be no improvisation. Once airborne, the pilot could not fix anything. The climb profile was locked, the timing unforgiving. If the math was wrong, even slightly, the attempt would fail silently, unnoticed, and history would remain unchanged. On the day of the attempt, there were no sirens, no drama, no sense of spectacle, just a calm understanding that something fragile was about to be tested. Far above, the SR-71 was already cruising, smooth, stable, untouched. On the runway below, a Lightning waited, engines ready, fuel scarce, plan absolute. Because Britain wasn't trying to prove the Blackbird could be beaten. They were about to prove something far more unsettling, that even the most dominant aircraft in history still lived inside a timetable. The moment the Lightning left the runway, the margin disappeared. This was not a normal takeoff. There was no shallow climb, no gradual buildup. The aircraft rotated hard, nose pitching aggressively skyward, engines screaming toward limits that would be unacceptable in almost any other mission. Below, the runway vanished, the sea followed, altitude arrived fast, too fast for comfort. Fuel began draining at a rate that made endurance meaningless. Inside the cockpit, there was no room for doubt. Every second mattered now.
The Lightning wasn't climbing toward the Blackbird, it was climbing toward a moment. Miss it, and nothing else would matter. As the aircraft punched upward, the sky began to change. Blue thinned, control response softened. The Lightning entered air where mistakes stopped being recoverable and instincts became unreliable. Too steep and the jet would bleed energy before the window opened. Too shallow and it would never reach the required height in time. Ground controllers stayed quiet. They didn't need to guide the pilot. The Blackbird's path was already known. Entry point, speed, altitude, timing. This wasn't a chase, this was a scheduled arrival. The pilot's only task was to trust the numbers and stay on profile. Above, the SR-71 was doing exactly what it always did. At Mach 3, the Blackbird didn't feel fast from inside. It felt smooth, stable. The horizon barely moved. Instruments stayed calm. There was no reason to scan for fighters, because fighters never survived long enough to matter at this altitude. The aircraft's defense wasn't awareness, it was inevitability. That inevitability was about to be tested. As the Lightning climbed higher, the sky darkened noticeably. The curvature of the Earth hinted itself into view. This was borrowed altitude, never meant to be held. The pilot eased the climb just enough to preserve energy, riding a razor-thin balance between gain and loss. This was the critical phase. A few seconds too early, and the Lightning would arrive to empty sky. A few seconds too late, and the Blackbird would already be gone. Then something changed. Radar information sharpened. Abstract symbols resolved into certainty. The timing still worked, barely. Visual cues began to form where none should exist. A shape appeared. Long, sharp, black. The SR-71.
It was enormous in a way no diagram could convey. Not behind, not ahead, but there, sharing the same impossible slice of sky. For the Lightning pilot, this was the entire mission condensed into a single breath. Years of planning made real. Inside the Blackbird cockpit, surprise registered just as quickly. A fighter had appeared where fighters did not belong. Not closing fast, not maneuvering, simply present. That alone was enough to break an assumption that had held for years. There was no reaction, no defensive move, no urgency. The Blackbird didn't need to respond. Because the window was already closing. Fuel was nearly gone. Energy margins were bleeding away. The Lightning could not stay, not even if the pilot wanted to. This aircraft was built to arrive, not to remain. For a few seconds, measured in heartbeats, the two aircraft shared airspace no one believed possible. Close enough to see, close enough to acknowledge, close enough to prove the point. Then gravity reclaimed its debt. The Lightning eased its nose down, slipping away gently, carefully, before success could turn into catastrophe. Above, the SR-71 continued forward, unchanged, already pulling away. The encounter ended without a word, but the meaning of it didn't. Because the Blackbird hadn't been threatened, it had been met. And that distinction mattered more than anyone on either side wanted to admit. The Lightning was already descending when the realization settled in. Nothing dramatic had happened. No alarms, no maneuvers, no confrontation, and yet something fundamental had shifted, quietly, irreversibly. The SR-71 continued its mission exactly as planned, speed and altitude untouched. By every operational measure, it had won. And still, something had changed. Back on the ground, there were no celebrations, no official reports declaring success. The RAF had never intended to intercept the Blackbird in the traditional sense. They had proven something more subtle and far more uncomfortable. That dominance has conditions. The SR-71's legend was never about invisibility or invulnerability. It was about existing so far beyond the response curve that reaction became meaningless.
But this encounter exposed a narrow overlap between two extremes. One aircraft optimized for sustained speed at the edge of space, the other built to trade everything, fuel, endurance, safety margins, for a single vertical arrival. Neither design philosophy was flawed. They were simply different. This is where aviation myths and reality diverge. In popular retellings, the story becomes exaggerated. Some claim the Lightning escorted the Blackbird. Others insist it chased it. Both miss the truth. There was no escort, no pursuit, only a precisely timed coincidence, possible only because both aircraft were performing exactly as designed. The Lightning didn't win by being better. The Blackbird didn't lose by being slower. Success belonged to preparation. The SR-71 flew predictable routes not out of complacency, but necessity. At Mach 3, deviation was dangerous. Thermal stress, fuel consumption, and navigation demanded discipline. That discipline created reliability. Reliability created a timetable. And the timetable created a window, small enough to ignore, but real enough to exploit. And exploit it they did. For the Americans, the encounter confirmed something already understood. The SR-71's supremacy didn't come from secrecy, but inevitability. Seeing a fighter briefly appear didn't invalidate the mission. It reinforced how extreme the conditions had to be just to touch its world. For the British, the moment validated a different lesson. Air superiority is not always about matching strength with strength. Sometimes it's about asking better questions, not how fast or how high, but when. That mindset would outlast the Lightning itself. Both aircraft would eventually retire, leaving behind stories that blurred into legend. But this one endures because it resists simplification. There is no humiliation here, no triumph, just professionals operating at the edges of physics, acknowledging each other briefly and moving on. Two machines, two philosophies, one impossible moment. The SR-71 remained unmatched. The Lightning remained extraordinary. And for a few seconds at 85,000 feet, the sky was not as empty as everyone believed. Because in aviation, as in power, absolutes rarely survive close inspection. And sometimes the most important victories don't look like victories at all. They look like silence.